afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode number 49, and today we have Maggie back. Maggie still here in New Hampshire, so
indeed. From my parents' basement this time, so we're
Right.
really covering all the territory.
Right. I'd say here where the sun is shining, but except we're both in basements, so yeah, not so much on the sunshine, but nor is there sunshine outside indeed today. But
And we just had a terrible lightning storm and lost our internet for a few minutes. So I don't know
Yes.
if that hit you. He's only half an hour away from me, but it's like completely different ecosystem sometimes. But if I
Yep.
disappear, you'll know why.
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, I had a one of those power flickers last night that, made me had to reboot my whole computer and rebooted the router. So it's one of those like
Sweet.
loss of power for a fraction of a second. Inconvenient for several minutes. But anyway, yeah. So what we hope for the best as far as our continued power here for this discussion. So today it's obviously in Other Minds and Hands we talk about we're talking about adaptation. Today we want to talk about one of the things I know, Maggie, which is really important to you, and that's fan engagement. We want to think about what adaptations do, what they have done, and what they need to do in order to engage with people, because it's such a different thing. Engaging with fans, like all movies hope to have fans, right? I mean, that's sort of a general thing, but it's a different world when you're doing an adaptation.
Yeah, and Corey and I have been talking a lot about this as we're setting up Signum Studios and with Ben Davis as well, just like what does this mean if we're gonna, help studios and help folks with fan engagement? What does fan engagement actually mean? So it's been really fun. We've had some really interesting conversations. So we just thought we'd bring some of that to you guys too, and see if we can play around with some of the texts that we know and the adaptations that we're familiar with from talking about them here, and just kind of expand that a bit. So like it started with our conversation of, well, what is fan engagement? What are the different definitions of it? And there's kind of two really clear ones. There's like one that I think is marketing speak for fan engagement, and that means clicks, right? That
Right.
means immediate reactions.
Right.
That means we launched at midnight and we were trending on Twitter and we shut down the site and the tickets sold out in 10 seconds and whatever
Right.
else is event motivated. And that's still really important. I think that kind of engagement is a really good data marker. It's a really interesting thing to look at. It's a really interesting thing to discuss, but that's so often not what we're talking about when we talk about fan engagement. So I'm aware of that fan engagement, and it's necessary to like speak that lingo when working within industry and things like that. But the fan engagement that I think is missed by people only knowing the data definition is that deeper connection to a fandom.
Yes.
And when you're talking about adaptations and adaptations that have a strong fan base, and not just strong, but like long, the Tolkien
Yes.
fandom is broad. And that doesn't have to be like a long-standing fandom. It can be something that's only been out for a few months and still has a vociferous, like really passionate fan base. But it's just recognizing what that fan base cares about, what they know, what they have access to, understanding what makes them tick. And it's not going to be a clear, simple answer. But it's really getting down into the fandom and really connecting with what they care about. And that is the piece that I think is just still so foreign to most industry creators. And it's such a shame because it's not an easy thing to do. It does take time,
No.
and it certainly takes an ability to kind of see through some of the noise. But you got to do some research around it and things like that. But it's not impossible, and it doesn't take much to at least show that you're trying. And it only takes a second for a fandom to turn on you. So, the example that I give a lot is The Darkest Rising sequence by Susan Cooper.
Right.
MTV, it was the production company behind it. They no longer have a studio making films, so they didn't do a very good job. But they were producing The Seeker. It was a 2007 film based on The Darkest Rising, which is the second book in the series. And they hired, through a contest, they hired an on-set PA, a production assistant. So there was this contest, like, you could work on the set of The Darkest Rising. And they ended up getting this kid, and he was an intern on the set, and his job was to film small interview pieces that would go before and after commercial breaks of their shows. So just be like a 30 to 40 second bit interviewing to kind of hype up the film and try to engage people. This is 2007, the very early days of the kind of engagement. And the first interview they put out, they were interviewing the lead actor, whose name I'm blanking on. He played Merriman. I can see him. Ian McShane. Um, they were interviewing Ian McShane. Oh, our lights just flickered again.
Yes, I didn't mind.
It'll be fine. It'll be fine. And they interviewed him, and they were like, "Aren't you excited to play this character for potentially 5 films?" And he goes, "There's 5. We might have to do it again." Like, one, he did it on camera. He did it to the MTV hired intern. Somebody approved it and decided to put it out. Like, there's so many levels of mistakes there. And then it ended up coming out that only the director and one producer had actually read the text. They churned it out so fast. Nobody had talked to Susan Cooper about it. And, this kind of goes back to my whole, like, you don't have to engage the author to make a good film, but you're really risky. And you're really risking a lot of success and alienation of the fan base if you don't incorporate them, because Susan Cooper was like, not my thing. I'm not engaged. So nobody was, nobody was supporting it. But yeah, it just kind of shows that level of engagement. If they had simply gone the route of some other things, like JD and Patrick have always shown us with their commitment to the lore and knowledge of elements of Rings of Power from Silmarillion, like, it just doesn't take that much to show a bit. And the more you can show, the more street cred you get. And like, there was another one from my Twilight stuff where I was sitting in Video Village, which is like an offset little tent with video monitors, so you can watch what's being filmed but not actually be in the room where it's filming, because some of those rooms are really tiny. So I was sitting there just like staying out of the way and stuff, and I was listening to these 2 producers talking to each other. And Robert Pattinson couldn't remember his line. He kept messing it up over and over and over again. And the 2 of them were whispering to each other and said, "He has 3 PhDs. He should know this by now, right?" That was a reference to a like unknown, unpublished thing that Stephanie Meyer put on her website about him going to medical school multiple times. So like, they did their work, and that wasn't in an interview. That was like a quiet, hushed between each other conversation. But the street cred they got from me, big deal.
Right.
So those are just 2 little examples of like good behavior, bad behavior, right? But if you are able to show that to a fandom, they're not going to love you, but they might keep their torches unlit for a minute. They might give you a chance to kind of to see what you're going to do with it. So it's that level of engagement, that kind of idea of getting to know what people care about. And that's the stuff that I get super interested in and very excited about. And yeah, so that's the content side of it. Like, what to do with it, I think, is the next thing. So if you have that kind of support, the fans know that you care, you've shown that you're on their side, you tend to get a little bit more creative freedom. You have their approval, you've managed expectations, it's in good hands, all that kind of thing. And then we get something like Alfonso Cuarón with Harry Potter. Like, he was allowed to take certain liberties because everybody was already on board, so you could get a little bit more creative. So if you kind of plan out some engagement like that, yeah, you'll get the clickbait, you'll get the hits, you'll get the marketing, it's a different kind of vibe. But this level of engagement, you're going to satisfy those people that are super skeptical and don't want you to touch their piece. I don't want you to mess with my beloved,
Right.
You're going to satisfy those skeptics, but then you're also going to create something that your new fans are going to come to and be like, oh, they knew their stuff because they saw the movie, they loved it, they went and read the book, got so much more appreciation because you brought all that into the film process. Right. I could do on this for a while, so I'll pause there.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, one of the things that I think about in conjunction with that, I mean, it's been part of the experience that we've had for the last year and a half doing this broadcast too, and it's the thing that has struck me most about, being, I don't know, kind of on the front lines of the fan engagement side in the Rings of Power last year. The thing that kept striking me as I was hearing from people, I was seeing people's reactions, I was talking to people who were in the middle of reacting to the show and things, is just that it was less often was I saying like, oh, I don't think you're being, fair to the choice that's being made. It's that people so many times it seemed like, I mean, it's why I wanted to start this broadcast, to think through, like, what does it mean to do an adaptation? What makes an adaptation good? How can we kind of, where is there a place where we can talk about and really honestly learn about a lot of these things? And I've learned a very great deal over the course of the last year and a half in this. That is, like, you just think of some of the basic things that we've talked about before, about how so frequently when you get a fan who is a fan of a set of books, say, and they're going to watch a film, and they don't think about adaptation a lot. Like, they don't, these questions of, like, they've never made an adaptation, right? Those kinds of questions. It's almost like somebody reading a translation without ever having done a translation before, without ever having done any translation work. Like, you can't really appreciate, like, the kinds of choices that have to be made and the difficulty of some of those choices. There were so many things that I heard people saying, for instance, about the Rings of Power, like, oh, this is like this thing that they did shows a complete disregard for, or like, this just proves they know nothing about Tolkien. And I was like, but no, that's actually a really simple adaptation. Like, you have to make choices like that when you're doing a screen adaptation of any book. Like, that's not even a realistic expectation, like. Anyway, so those kinds of issues, like that whole kind of broad category of issues, is one of the things that it seems to me is so important when trying to, like, there's always going to be a gap that needs to be bridged. As we've talked about before, anytime an adaptation is always going to project someone else's sort of vision, right? It's not like the thing that you will never find, right? You will never find an adaptation which is just like the version of the book that was in your head projected onto a screen, right? There's
even if
always
you make
gonna
it.
Even if you make it, that's not going to be it, right?
It's not going to happen. Yeah.
Right. It's true. And
actually,
so
especially if you make it, because you probably have a vision, but you have to answer to studios and budgets,
right.
and
right, or you'll be more painfully aware of the discrepancy, if you're the one making it. Right. True. Anyway, I think that that works. So I think about, like, what exactly can people do, like, productions, like, can studios do in order to bridge that gap? Because there's always going to be that gap. There's always going to be resistance. I mean, I still know people, lots of people, who won't watch the Peter Jackson, have never watched the Peter Jackson films, won't ever watch, don't want to talk about the Peter Jackson films. Which, again, like, as I've said many times, I think there are many things to criticize about them from a Tolkien perspective. They're very imperfect as far as an adaptation of Tolkien is concerned, but they're wonderful movies. And, anyway, but, like, so even with a really shining good example, like the Peter Jackson films, there's always going to be a gap that needs to be bridged between the fans of the original, of the original product, and the fans of the, and the films.
And you're never going to satisfy everyone. Like, you have to give that up from the start. But if you are a creator, I just feel like there's a lot of different, there's so many pressures on a creator anyway. Like, you want to make the thing that you see in your mind and you're proud of. You want to make this thing that is successful and has good critical reviews.
Right.
You also want this thing that makes a lot of money and brings a lot of people to buy it or see it or share it or talk about it, because that's how you get to continue working in this field. Like, there's so many pressures that kind of fall within it. So when you're talking about satisfying a fan base, that's not always a top priority, because they don't see down to that minute level. But it's the power of the fan base that is so underestimated. Like, if you muck it up with them, you've lost this incredible street team that would have been sharing all of that. And it's just a shame. And I was just thinking about the two comments here from Nameless Arcanum and Icon. You're both saying, about momentum of marketing and how that can really raise the hype of something, but then it falls flat due to not a great story. That's such a good example of, like, the marketing engagement working, but the story engagement not. So even if they tried to do fan engagement in the story development, they missed the mark, like, maybe they were just trying to make it too broad, so therefore it didn't appeal to anyone. If you did it just for the fans, it's too niche, people aren't going to understand it. Although we've talked about that with Rings of Power, because we
Yeah.
did, and everybody understood it.
Yeah.
And they're still getting stuff from it. But it's doing that work in the story development when you're doing that adaptation. What do people care about? What do you need to keep? What can change? What can you do to all that story stuff without confusing a new viewer, but still
Right.
satisfy those people that know every stinking detail and are going to be picking it apart with a fine-tooth comb? So the two don't always talk to each other either, which is quite problematic. You need marketing and production to kind of work hand in hand, because they're both talking about engagement. They're just really different kinds of engagement.
Right. Right. Yeah. Spielkalb was just saying maybe the best way to go is not even try to close the gap, but push forward your own vision, like Moffat did with Sherlock. What I mean by closing the gap is not, as you said, Maggie, you're not going to please everybody. Like that's not the point. But I would point to, well, I'd put to myself as an example, right? The way that I'm engaging with the Jackson film is like good engage. Okay, that's what they would want. Like as a fan, I mean, right? I mean, I like if people both dislike and distrust the entire project so much that they won't even engage with it, and they like refuse to talk about it, and like that's not a great situation, right? And again, there's always going to be some holdouts that will still remain in that camp. Again, it's not about uniform popularity or 100% success, but the more fans you can get out of that camp who are just like, this is dead to me, I'm going to proceed as if it doesn't exist, that seems to me like for every fan who says that, you have failed with that fan. Right. And some of them, again, will be that way no matter what. But you do need, you can talk about pushing your own vision, but it's not relevant if, they refuse to even watch it or engage with it. Right. And that's what I'm talking about. When I talk about bridging the gap, that's what I mean. Like, are you willing to take the step? Are you willing to come along with, are you willing to give the benefit of the doubt? Are you willing to, to take that initial step?
And with so many fans, if they're not willing to engage, there's not much you can do. So, some fans are just never going to, because they want to maintain the purity of the original text. But okay, good luck with that. But, like we've said a million times, you can watch something and still maintain the purity of the original text. Like, it's not going to change the book that you love. You can say, not for me, I'm going back to the book. That's fine. And then there's also fans that I think are quite threatened by an adaptation, because all of a sudden it's like the public is looking in on their super secret love, and it's mine, you can't have it. Now they have to share it with the world that doesn't understand it the way they do, and this is where all that language of betrayal and whatnot comes into play. You feel threatened by somebody else liking the thing you like, so you double down on no, I'm not engaged with that film, they couldn't have done it right, I know how it's done right, and you get very defensive about it. That's a tough one. So I have to say, like a creator, like consulting on that, you wouldn't aim for those people. You would aim for the people that are going to come see it because they're curious, but they might be a little worried, but they visit the websites, they talk on the chat rooms, like all that kind of stuff of just engaging with the people that are already engaging with it. And already are a part of a community. That helps. If they're willing to jump on Reddit and have a Discord and everything else, then those are the ones you want to start that conversation with. See what they care about. See what they're worried about. Right.
Yeah. So one thing that I'm noticing, and I'd love to hear you talk about this distinction a little bit more, is that it sounds to me like there's kind of two different phases of fan engagement that you're pointing to, and they seem to me different kind of projects. There's the engagement with fans in advance, so like there's basically before and after the thing comes out, right? There's the kind of engagement which is establishing a relationship with the fans so that they're willing to come, right? So that they are like putting the fans in the frame of mind where they are going to take the thing seriously, building street cred, as you said, and that's it's good to do that in advance so that people are are ready to be in the right frame of mind. They're not going to like love it before they've seen it, right? But to put them in a frame of mind where they're willing to like give you the benefit of the doubt, to believe that this is likely to be a good thing. And then there's the engagement after the fact that is more about understanding. Again, you might not agree with every choice that was made, but understanding what's going on and how this is, because there will always be questions. People, when people are struck by, as will happen 100% of the time, the differences between not only, as we've talked about, not only between the film and the book, but more importantly, and a distinction so rarely made by people who are talking about this on the internet, the difference between the film and the version of the book that's in my head, right? Mm-hmm. Which may not even be something that's based explicitly on the page. But in any case, when a viewer is struck by those differences, right, now there's always stuff people have to work through. Like, therapy is required for all adaptations, I think, and so that phase, like the sort of the working through the analysis phase, like let's look at what's there, think it through, work it through, and that seems to me a different sort of subspecies of fan engagement than the preliminary fan engagement.
That's exactly what I was going to say. There's like the development engagement, and again, there's two definitions for engagement. We've decided this, right? So we've got marketing engagement and we've got story engagement. So we're in story engagement right now. So we've got like development engagement that is pretty much what Amazon did with us, right? So they had this core community. They built this really beautiful 2-day event where we got to see Tolkien's life and go to Oxford and, do all the, listen to a really wonderful academic talk by John Garth and just engage on that level. And it wasn't what's the word I want? Over scheduled or over managed. It was guys, go enjoy.
Right.
Just, yes, there's a schedule and it is tight, but go enjoy. And then the second day was when we got to see 20 minutes of the forthcoming season and had an hour and a half with JD and Patrick. And that hour and a half was what we've been saying for the whole time, was what was most useful and most necessary for that room full of people, because they showed us their engagement with the development side of things. And they assured us that was good. I mean, people were really giving them kind of baiting, I'm going to get you questions. And they rose to every single one of them.
Right.
Why they didn't put that out, why they didn't show the broader fandom a snippet of their knowledge ahead of time on a brief YouTube clip that would have made the rounds, is the thing that still baffles me the most about the development engagement element, because that would have assured so many people, these guys know their stuff, let's go in with an open mind. But if they'd done that and then didn't have an analysis engagement after, it would have been for naught. But they didn't do that either. So that was also really tough, because we didn't have the ability to then dig into what was there and talk about what we knew about their knowledge ahead of time and how that was shown in the analysis afterwards. So there's just this gap. And again, you need to bridge that. The show was trying to bridge those two things, but they didn't give us an anchor on either side of the river. So it was just tough to make all that happen. Whereas Jackson, if we take that into Peter Jackson, we didn't have a ton of development engagement coming out. Also, this was filmed 97 to 99 and released 2001 to 2003. So we didn't have the internet like we do now.
Right.
But we still had engagement. Like, they were still sharing things. Like, I remember one of the first photos that came out to publicize the film was Peter Jackson lying in a tree smoking a pipe looking like a hobbit. He was trying to connect with the fans, and I understand visually. It was after, with the extended edition appendices, that we got to see all the development before, right? Yes. That's where we got to see that they hired the concept artists that worked with Tolkien. We saw John Howe doing the concept art. Anything, like you were saying, like whatever was in our brain was never going to be exactly on screen, but did they do their best to make sure they honored what was in our brain. So they were drawing in this kind of stuff, and they were talking about their knowledge and love of the text and showing us the detail about what went into set design, and each realm having their own kind of color scheme and history to their chainmail, and that level of depth and those hours and hours and hours of analysis and behind the scenes content that built this fandom. That
Yes.
that built the stuff that we continue talking about, and that was 20 years ago.
Yes.
Old,
Yes.
but cool.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I do think the all of the special features on, in the appendices, as they're called. And by the way, even that, even the fact that those are known as the appendices of the Lord of the Rings DVDs, right?
Yeah.
Establishes this connection, is like an expression of that connection with the books in this way. Like, obviously the appendices of the DVDs have no real parallel to the appendices of the books.
No.
And yet again, it's the fact that they're kind of in a sense, even just the fact that they're talked about the same way, I think is really interesting. But no, I think that was a remarkable element of the success. I mean, it's something that I would definitely, I genuinely believe that the Lord of the Rings films would not have been the kind of generational cultural sensation that they were without the appendices, without all that extra material that they included that kept people engaging on newer and deeper levels all the time with that material. I mean, the movies were popular. But there have been lots of popular movies. There are lots of movies that have a really, really good, box
Blockbuster
office
intakes and
right.
yeah.
And then 3 years later, you're like, oh yeah, remember that movie? Yeah, kind of, right? Why weren't the Lord of the Rings films like that? Like, why did the Lord of the Rings films have the enduring impact that they did? And that is because the appendices, I think, is in a significant large part.
And the not just to the lore and the story either, but to the entire community they built of appreciators. It wasn't just Tolkien fans. It's definitely what got me into film. The curtain was lifted. We got to see how the sausage was made, and it was amazing. It wasn't gross like sausage at all. It was lovely. I hate that analogy, but it does work.
Right.
But yeah, and like the number of people I've talked to that are like costume designers now, and they're like, well, yeah, watching how they wove the cloaks together for the hobbits of that elven cloth. I'm like, oh my God, you were there too? And they're like, yeah. And then I went to the museum exhibit. I'm like, I know, the museum exhibit, right? It just kept going. They gave us so many opportunities to see the depth of their engagement. So therefore my engagement was so much bigger, and then my community expanded amongst that. So that's the one thing I don't think they did. They didn't create the community platforms, but that I think was a good thing. Like, for that to be organic and off corporate platforms, shiny. If Amazon started their own chat right now, I'd be like, oh guys, don't do that, because I don't want Big Brother watching. Like, you guys can tune into Reddit and Discord if you want, but
right.
Yeah, the communities that built up organically from that kind of engagement, it continues having us talk 20 years later, and Don Marshall's still trying to get his re-release out of
yes.
the extended editions, and
right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Now, I mean, but that's doing, whether it's, the one thing that I would say, honestly, I actually have a complaint about the appendices, is that I think they talked about the books too little. I mean,
that's fair.
It was fascinating. Like, I love the behind the scenes stuff. But I mean, I didn't have the reaction to it like that you did, for instance, where, for you, it's kind of what like brought you into the film industry. It did have an impact on me, even though like I'm not, especially interested in the back end of filmmaking in that same way. It did build, even though when I look back on it, I didn't even sort of realize at the time the extent to which they were building credibility with me as I was watching through that, right? There were still things I was grumpy about, right? There were still things that I didn't like. There were things in the appendices that bothered me. I mean, like, I can still think off the top of my head of like several things that somebody says in a commentary track or somebody says in one of the videos that like riled me at the time, and I'm like, what? How could you say that? But
that's great though, because you had a reaction. You were
yes,
engaging.
I did.
You the opportunity. Yeah.
It would, yeah, and so again, it's not that I was like watching them and I was like, oh, I love these movies completely and everything about them, right? But yet, it was clear like you couldn't just dismiss them.
Yeah.
Like as a Tolkien fan, if you just said, there was no way that I could maintain, a sort of a purist, a totally purist attitude, right? Where I'm just like, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. Like, right. They're just butchering Tolkien and they don't know what they're talking about. And I'm writing them off. Like, it was very hard to write them off. I could still disagree with them. Right. And I do still to this day disagree with them about many things, but I don't, but I couldn't write them off, right? I had to respect them. As I said, what I would love, there was some good stuff. There was some good, some good Tolkien discussion. What there wasn't enough of for me is what we do here, right? Yeah. Like, let's take the book and let's take the films and let's discuss point by point, like the recent series that we were just doing on the Peter Jackson adaptation and talking through all these different stuff. That I would have loved to see more discussion of. Like, let's talk about elves. What's the film doing with elves? All these things. Whatever.
And that was super top level, So like, imagine if we had planned ahead, made an outline, anything like that, and had the creators alongside us, having those levels of conversation about development engagement for themselves in relation to development engagement from their fandom through to the analysis afterwards. Let us show you what we did here, and having us ask the questions while they talk about it. Like, that's the depth we're after, folks. Like, that would be so much fun.
Yes. Yeah. It really would. Now, Icon, you say an interesting thing there. Most movies now are more interested in their opening weekend than their longevity. I think that might be true, but I have to say, I find it very odd. Because in some ways, if you look at the current situation, that is, look at the modern streaming economy versus the, 90s and 2000s DVD economy, right? You would think that longevity would be more greatly incentivized now than it was then. Because then, in 2004, like the time when the extended editions were coming out and the boxed sets and everything like that, okay, by putting all that work into the appendices, you could induce people to buy the DVD set again, right? They might have bought a DVD as soon as it was released, the theatrical release, and then bought the box set when it came out, which we did, right? So yes, you're inducing 2 purchases instead of 1 out of people. And that's a thing gained, if you're selling millions of copies, that's fine. But once you've sold them 1 copy of your extended edition DVDs, which they're watching and rewatching for years afterwards, right? And forming their lives as we've seen, financially, they didn't benefit from that anymore, other than possibly like merch sales and stuff like that, right? But in the streaming economy, you would benefit. Yeah. If you're driving viewers back to, and they're rewatching and rewatching, if you put all that, if all that stuff lived, like, imagine, like, just like people watching, imagine the number of times you've watched the Peter Jackson films and the appendices over the course of your life, right? And imagine what how much a streaming platform would love those numbers, right? Yeah. Would love to have people coming back to being driven back to their platform to watch stuff again and again. So again, like that kind of longevity, it seems to me the depth of foolishness. I'm not contesting, Icon, that you're right. I think it's very likely true that they care more about opening weekend than longevity. But that strikes me as deeply foolish. Deeply foolish.
And it's also like, it's definitely what the papers care about the most, right? Like, that's always the headline, what box office numbers for that weekend. Like, that's all we're hearing about Barbie and Oppenheimer is their box office intake at the weekend. And studios love that because that gets into the papers. That means that they get 21 weeks in cinema instead of 4 weeks in cinema. So, like, sure, they're absolutely going after that immediate box office win. But if you don't have longevity, exactly like you said, they're not going to buy the DVD anymore. They're not going to care when it's on a streaming device. They're not going to notice that it's on their plane. Like, all these things that became these big moments, not necessarily a thing. I don't know enough about the strikes now to kind of go into detail, so I'm learning a little bit more about that. But all of this is just kind of crystallizing the current issues there are with that too, because 100% we're going to watch them 1,000 times over on streaming services, but none of that's getting kicked back to the people that helped make them. Maybe 1 or 2 people, right? It's mostly studio. And the streaming numbers, like, learning a bit more about what is marked as good and successful for them in that. Like somebody told me Netflix, it's a 50% engagement. So if 50% of the viewers finish the series, then it gets a second season. So if you only have 10 people watching the series, but 5 of them finished, you'll get a second season. And that's why I'm like, that can't be right. That seems like weird math. And then we've heard about percentage finishing with Rings of Power. Like, you know, I don't know. Obviously, they're collecting all that data, but we don't know where the levels are for like what constitutes a success, because it's not the headline in the newspaper. So for our purposes, box office is still like the biggest way that you can show success. Great. Money's handy to like have that data point.
Yes.
But longevity, you know, and building that community, that continued success, that continued engagement, that's why we're still buying editions of Lord of the Rings. That's why we're still attending conferences. That's why we're watching Rings of Power, because this thing engaged us so thoroughly. Right. We will then extend out to another adaptation of another thing based off this content that we love.
Right.
So if you're the one that screws it up, you know, I've been burned by The Hobbit. I'm never going to watch Lord of the Rings again. Right. That's a tough one to bear. So.
Right. Yeah, and of course, I'm not suggesting that the two things are alternative. That is, like the opening box office and the longevity. Nor am I saying like if you have to choose one, you should choose longevity over box office. I'm just saying
you can have both.
You can have both. There's no reason you can't have both. I mean, in fact, the bigger your opening box office is, the better, the easier it will be to build longevity. And that I don't even think that is... I don't even think that that's hard to do. Like, it's not like it's an expensive proposition to do, to build longevity.
That's the thing that's a real kicker. Like,
yes.
I feel like if we could just pull these creators to the side for a minute and a half and be like, can you get these 3 bullet points? Cool. That gets you 5% more. If you could do these 3 bullet points with these 7 sub bullet points, you know, that'll give you 10, 15% more. Like, it's not easy, like anyone could do it, but it doesn't take a ton of work to get some of this done.
No, it doesn't take a ton of work.
Yeah.
And of course, this is the stuff that we love. I mean, and it's especially hard for me, right, to understand why people don't do this, because this is what I do, right? Like the
of course
discussing and analyzing things. Like, come on, man, it's not just about being right and wrong. It's about like finding it easy, hard, or desirable to do. It's like, so the hard thing for me is like, why would people not want to discuss it afterwards? Like, obviously, that's where the fun is. Like, you know, but yeah, I think that it would, but in particular, of course, it seems especially obviously desirable and even influencing your, your initial reaction. Not just box office. We're not just talking about, movies in release. We're talking about, streaming TV and stuff like that as well. But doing stuff when you have a long running show, or some kind of serial property, right? Even something like the War of the Rohirrim, right? That's not necessarily going to be serial in the sense of like there's going to be more Rohirrim films after, but there's going to be other like things of that kind, presumably. It was like when that like quasi news story broke a while back, which like a whole bunch of people outside the Tolkien world seemed to view as like huge breaking news, that like, they said there were going to be more films based on Tolkien released soon, and I'm like,
and we're like,
yeah. I mean, of course there will be. Like we all knew. I kept waiting for there to be actual news. Like, wait, so are we? Does this mean there's gonna be actual news about what it is, and what the plans are, and the things that? No, and there was nothing. It was just like, we have the vague intention to produce films, and I'm like, golly, I guessed that all on my own. When you spent hundreds of millions of dollars for the rights, exactly, right? Shocking. But anyway, so even in that sense, right? Even if what the films that like Warner Brothers is doing with the Embracer Group or whatever, if those things turn out to be totally unrelated films. Like they're still like you still want to build momentum there, right? And obviously with things like The Rings of Power, you want to build momentum, in between season and not let people. There's anyway. So again, that kind of longevity is to me a much more present reality, like a much more important market factor in the streaming economy than it ever was before, right? Because again, even it's still there, even for people like you don't even have to like you think about the way that the marketing challenge, right, in the old days was to, like first you've got to get them to come to the film, right? And then you want them to love the film enough that they buy the DVD when it comes out, right?
Or see the movie 17 more times in
or
the cinema,
right,
so
exactly,
they
yeah.
brag to
See
their
the movie,
friends,
then see
right?
it 17 more times, then buy the DVD, yeah. And so those are like, purchase choices, right? Individual purchase choices that the person has to make. If you're talking about a Netflix show or a Prime Video show or something like you're not even talking about those kinds of purchase choices, right? They've already made the purchase choice to subscribe, right? And I know there's the dynamics of like, do they maintain their subscription or whatever? I'm not saying that's not itself an important purchase choice, but it's not a purchase choice that rests on that production alone,
right,
in the same way, right? I mean, if you to say like, hey, you already have Netflix, turn it on and watch this show is a completely different kind of sales proposition than go out and buy the DVD
with this specific thing, right?
Yeah.
And so it can
it
can be the kind of thing that makes you purchase a subscription from the start. The number of my friends that bought Disney Plus when Hamilton was on there,
right?
Huge, absolutely.
Right.
But they also did the 14-day trial and then bailed. So how do you get them? Yeah, how do you get them to stay? And it's not the same. I keep using the word engagement, but that's what it is. It's not the same engagement that you have from fandoms because there aren't these targeted event moments, which is why marketing works so hard for those targeting event moments.
Yes.
But all of it's going to fall flat if there isn't that development in the first part that we can engage with and care about story.
Yeah.
You do all the marketing in the world that you want, but if we don't care about what you're saying and showing us, then I'm not going to watch season 2. Yeah. And so it gets harder to greenlight those things. I think that's the real trick, though, when you see these streaming services buying these multi-book properties.
Right.
Because it's a real risk. Like, we have huge expectations for however many series of The Witcher, Wheel of Time, all of these things that have lots of books to them. And I want to see all of them. If you're going to do it, commit to all of them and tell me the whole story. Otherwise, I'm getting 1/8 of the story and it's not going to be good no matter what you do because it's just 1/8 of the story. But if you're going to cancel it after one season, that's not really responsible either. So that's what I do like that model with Rings of Power, that they have told us they will have 5 seasons. Of course, they can change their mind. Something terrible could still happen. I don't know.
Right.
But they made that commitment the same way New Line Cinema made the commitment to Peter Jackson to shoot all 3 at the same time.
Yeah.
Like, you're going to have the whole story.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll watch the whole thing and we'll see what happens.
Right.
But yeah.
Right. Yep. Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, this is the kind of thing that we're kind of excited about and thinking about, of how to, because this is the kind of thing that we do, right? This is when, Maggie and I have been talking about Signum. So for those of you who don't know, Signum University has a studio, right? Maggie's the director of our studios. And one of the things that we want to do, like one of the reasons we did this, is we think there's a gap here. We think that this whole category of stuff is a thing that the industry does not do well. I honestly don't think they know how to do it that well.
I don't think it's in their department structure, so therefore it doesn't happen. And this is exactly what we're talking about. There's 2 different modes of this development engagement and marketing engagement. Those are 2 different departments in studios. They don't always talk to each other. So it's a tough thing to get right, full stop. But it's also tough because it spans the whole story, and it's not easy to assign to one specific department.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and because it's also, but I would say like interpreting that departmental structure, right? Departmental structures exist as a reflection of what the institution believes is an important priority,
Required.
right? Like they have a marketing department because they know that marketing is important, right? They have a production department because that's what they do, right? But they don't, the reason that this doesn't fit into any of their departments, the reason that none of their departments specialize in doing this kind of thing is that it's a kind of thing they haven't been doing. They haven't been trying to do.
And it's the kind of thing that really has to sit alongside showrunners. Like, I think the people that consult on this kind of thing are not showrunners because they're not worried about schedules and budgets and things like that, but they have to be involved in all the things showrunners are involved in. So you're there from the beginning in the development, you're there through the after marketing and doing all the pitching and everything else and prepping for season 2 when season 1 hasn't even been released yet. And that's the level that they should be included, you know, because then they are having their finger in every pie and do understand all the moving pieces and can add in tidbits here or there where it makes sense and help mold and, you know, form these stories and make sure, like, you know, one of the things I keep referencing with Twilight is that Edward went and sat on Bella's bed. No, Bella went in and sat on Edward's bed was in the original script. And somebody was like, no, he's a vampire. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't have a bed. He's a black leather sofa. It doesn't matter, you know, but it's these tiny little details that if a fan saw her sit on a bed, they'd be like, nope, you got it wrong, out. Like, you don't have to lose fandoms over tiny details. Let us, you know, shape that kind of thing. Anyways, that's like script development, story engagement, consulting type stuff. But there's also this analysis side that we're just missing. Like, when they started getting rid of the DVD special features, a part of me died. Like, I love special features for the gag reel alone, if nothing else. But I love special features. And it's just so hard to find that content now. You can occasionally find 1 to 3 minute videos on YouTube that they've released to help promote something. And it'll be like 1 minute of the costumes or whatever. No, I want like 20 to 30 minutes of behind the scenes deeper content about that because I'm genuinely interested and now I'm going to engage further and more and find people to talk about it with and maybe make my own costume and go to Comic-Con and, you know, that's how you get legs. You continue to have those people show their engagement on all these platforms and raise profile for years.
Yes.
Yeah. Also, I saw earlier somebody asked if we went to Comic-Con. We didn't make it this year.
No, not this year. Yeah,
we'll wait till we have a thing to do. So not there this year.
Yeah.
Sorry, what were you gonna say?
No, I was gonna say. And I was gonna say we were talking about engaging for years, and again, like it's still on the streaming platform that you're still subscribed to. You can still watch it again and again. It's even easier, you know, to watch. And again, they're getting fed. They're getting numbers, right? They're getting the kind of views that they want to get from that. Whereas, again, you know, New Line Cinema has no idea how many times you watched the DVDs that you bought.
Right.
they don't know, right? Whereas, you know, Netflix will know how many times you've rewatched Stranger Things. Like that's you know, that's the way it will work. And
they'll know with some of these streamers like which scenes were the most impactful, like what scenes did people go back to and watch over and over and over and over and over and over again, you know, like what are the scenes that people are really latching onto, who are the characters that people are really latching onto, and it's that kind of intel that can then feed into further deeper fan engagement. Oh, you loved that scene with Adar where we did the Dutch angle, let's talk about that, you know, and give us some depth about that. And, you know, we were talking about that as an idea with Amazon. Like, they have this X-ray thing, which I didn't even know about until Corey told me. So, like, marketing. Didn't know that existed, that there was this option for more content. So, work on that. But, yeah, like, you would have that option when you're watching something or in a little extras bar beneath it on the streaming platform. Want to know more about the Adar scene? Like, just give us that. Because we want it. We love that bit.
Yeah, it is the frustrating thing that the streaming platforms actually have better and more dynamic ways to get people this kind of extra content, this kind of engaging content, than the old, you know, DVD extras were kind of clunky. Like it was. I mean, it's fine. Like, but it's nothing. There was no way to actually integrate the two in any way, right? Anyway.
There was no expectation with DVD. So Nameless Arcadian was just saying, do you know if they died because of streaming or if it wasn't brought over to streaming because of lack of demand? Like, I don't know why they died, but it wasn't something that was expected with a DVD. You didn't buy a DVD knowing there was going to be 17 different options. Like sometimes on the back it would give you a little menu of like bonus features include, you know, but that's about it. That could be 1 minute, that could be 1 hour of a documentary. You didn't know till you bought it. Excuse me. And like Corey said, we didn't have the numbers for DVDs, so they weren't able to tell how people engaged with those special features. So it was probably something that was never heavily required or seen as important with production, but it's the part that so many of us are missing now when we want that deeper side. So if there is a streaming service that has the opportunity for that, you would think they would make a few and stick it up there and see what the engagement was like, and then be like, oh, okay, that was pretty good and did cost us a lot, and now people are talking, let's do a few more of those and just see, because you could track that.
Cost
you could
us a
see.
lot. That's the really impossible thing for me to understand. Like, this would not be hard. This would not be, anyway, so this is one of the reasons why we're like, all right, fine, let's do it ourselves.
See what we can do. Yeah.
Let's do it ourselves. The kind of it's almost like there's, the sort of reputed conversation between Lewis and Tolkien, where they're like not seeing the kind of books that they wanted to read and figured they would have to write them themselves, right? To some extent, it's almost like that, right? The kind of analysis that we want to see on, especially in adaptations, especially on these kind of, fandom productions with fandoms. There is so much really interesting analysis to be done. There's so many fascinating discussions to be had. It would be really, really beneficial for these productions, for these studios to be producing their own stuff and stirring up these kinds of discussions and this kind of appreciation. But they're not doing it. So
Icon pointed out Disney Plus does a pretty good job of this. You are absolutely right. Disney Plus is pretty darn good at their Star Wars documentaries. So they have like 10 episodes per season of whatever thing you're watching. They probably have like 1 for 1. So, here's our documentary. Episode 1 of the documentary is about episode 1 of that series. And they sit down for like an hour and they talk to the costume designers, the musicians, like everybody. And I think those are probably as successful as the series. And I was just talking to my mom about this because, again, toddler. She was like, have you watched Frozen 2? I was like, no, I mean, I have watched it now, but it's because I watched the documentary on the making of Frozen 2 that I watched Frozen 2. So like there is this group of like, I'll access it by the creation if you let me. And that's kind of a higher end production. So like they did spend money on that. They did see the value in that. They did invest on creating the behind the scenes content and filming while on set and getting that backstage coverage, and then being in a beautiful studio and sitting down with 10 people and having those conversations. That part's not expensive. It's time. Those people are probably expensive and heavily booked, but it doesn't actually take that much. Like the content is there, sit them down, produce it well with high quality everything. Tick, done. And we want that stuff. And Disney documentaries are great. I wish they had loads of them for all of the things. But even the ones on like the parks and stuff, maybe want to go visit the parks again. That's what the deeper engagement does. Like, give me that content. I'll go back and rewatch it again and again and again.
Though I would add, although they're doing behind the scenes stuff, they're still not doing analysis like I would want to do. Like that's still
they're doing
happening.
Creation. Yeah, they're doing creation. They're not doing discussion.
Which I get. And the thing is, like, I'm not trying to blame the production studio. It's what they do. They're a production studio, right? So when they do features like that, they focus on what they do. Like they're like, hey, like we did all this work making the production. Let's show you the work that we did, which is great. Again, and I love that. And I'm not saying that's not cool, but there's more to be. Let's do analysis. Let's talk about it. Let's encourage this kind of the kind of deeper engagement that has people forming up fan groups and doing conventions, to like discuss it further, 10 years down the road. Like that's the kind of thing. I mean, again, that's where my own heart is. Again, that's why even in the Peter, like, even the Peter Jackson appendices, I find disappointing in this respect. They did some. They did more than I think. I've watched some of the Star Wars stuff, the Disney Plus stuff, but I didn't watch all that much of it because I was like, I was hoping for analysis, and I wasn't getting analysis, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and that's all about Gateway too, isn't it? So like, you know, I feel like we talked about that, I don't know, a year or so ago, when we talk about different ways to appeal to your fans. So if you've got video gamers, if you've got book fans, if you've got, you know, whatever it is, different ways to kind of bring them into the center. Okay, great. You've got the behind the scenes making of stuff. Here's how we made it. That's brilliant. We love that. That's really cool. But what about these guys that care about analysis? What about these guys that care about music? Tapping into those different elements is a real strength. And if you're missing one, why? You don't need to miss it. It's easy. Go get it, you know?
Yeah. And again, to like thinking back in terms of the like fan management, like, you know, the management of fans and the management, you know, how do you both set up positive reactions, and how do you, you know, help to
nurture that?
Nurture, nurture is a really good word, to nurture a positive ongoing relationship, especially because you're going to have a whole bunch, you know, you're going to have some people who will be haters and you can't worry about them. You know, some people who are going to embrace it right away, and that's awesome, but you're going to have a whole bunch of people who are like slow to warm up, right? They're there still to be won, right? And I really think there are a lot of people in that middle camp who will be brought around by discussion, by analysis, by let's look carefully at what's going on here. Let's really think about the kinds of adaptation choices that they've been making, the way in which they're engaging with the text. Just because they've changed a thing doesn't mean they're ignoring the text or not engaging with the text. Let's kind of think and talk this through a little bit more. I mean, again, this is what I do. But I think that it seems to me pretty clear that there are a lot of people who really who enjoy that and who benefit from that, and it just seems to me unquestionable that a production as a whole would really benefit from having more of that there. And I get the fact that that's not their thing, right? That's okay. It's our thing.
And it's not their thing because they're actively denying it. It's not their thing because it's not on their to-do list.
It's not on their to-do list, and it's not what they. Yeah, no, I mean it's not. It's sort of it's sort of not their world in that way, and that's fine.
And like you were saying with management, it's such a lovely, easy way to be proactive about fan management, because two things here. Like, one is the conversation you were having with me the other day about some of our circle and some of the very informed Tolkien folks that were saying, oh, I don't like that in this adaptation because XYZ. I'll never, you know. And you're like, actually, Tolkien said, da, 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 da. So there's this like level of nuance in unpublished elements and in all the other, you know, works that we have from Tolkien that people have probably read but might not be as familiar with as they are with the trilogy. But being able to reference that and being able to discuss that and say, actually, the showrunners knew that and they showed this bit. That's so powerful that you're kind of like covering your bases with analysis to say, oh, no, that could work. And here's why. Let me tell you. And it's really cool. But then proactive in a second way, because you're going to be creating this new audience by having an adaptation. Whether you like it or not, millions of people are going to watch this thing. They might hate it, they might love it, but millions of people are going to watch this thing. So have something at the ready for them to engage with that shows your depth. Because they're either going to hate it and then be calmed down by the analysis, or they're going to love it and be so enthusiastic by the deeper analysis that they're going to continue engaging. So just like having that as kind of a safety net is something I always search for when I'm a new fan of something, and I'm so sad when it's not there. So
no, exactly. I think that this is, and you know, in some ways, you know, this is one of the it really speaks to thinking about, like, you know, what is their thing and what is not their thing, and you know, what's our thing, right? It's one of the things that it wasn't the genesis of the Signum Studios idea, but I remember kind of sitting and talking about Signum Studios with a couple people several months after we had the idea. And I was realizing, like, okay, so there's a concept of an academic book press, but they're like the idea of an academic film studio it's not a
Doesn't
thing.
exist.
It,
And when you
it,
say a
it
film
doesn't
department,
exist.
they either teach film or they're the AV department.
Or the AV department. Yeah,
Yeah,
like yeah, exactly. But the idea of like, no, there needs to, exactly the void that we're showing, right? Again, the point is not to say, you know, shame on the people, on the movie studios for not producing this. Like when Disney Plus is doing the behind the scenes stuff, they're talking about what they know, right? They're doing what they do. This whole like, let's work through and do some really thoughtful analysis and think through, you know, what's going on in the show and what kinds of adaptation choices are being made. That's not what they do, right?
right.
That's what we do, right? That's what it, you know. So this kind of academic engagement, you know, this sort of, and I think there is such a huge benefit to be gained from having these discussions, even discussions led by people like us who are outside, in a sense, right? You don't just want to hear, because I think it's an important part of building that bridge between studios and productions and fans, as we were talking about. Yeah, you want to hear, like the showrunner saying, this is what was in my mind. That's cool. That's really good. That's really great. That's really important. But I think to some extent, it's even better to have, you know, a third party coming in and saying, well, let us look at what they did in this production and let us look at the book and let us, you know, as fellow fans, sit down and think this through and actually look at how this works. But
and the value of that, you know, like there's nothing we can do. You're always going to be called a shill, Corey, just accept that. But you know, the fact that you are able to do analysis, we're not talking about right and wrong and selling the thing and you should go see this thing because we love it and they paid us to say that. Like it's not, it's just analysis. Like we're just showing some stuff. I also realize this kind of sounds like we're being quite self-serving. Like we're the ones that can do it. It's like, no, we feel like we've just kind of recognized there's this whole thing that doesn't exist that we know people want. Right. And yeah, we can do it. Loads of other people can do it too. It's just this area, this field, this subject, this facility, you know, like all these things combined is like, oh, we can do this. Let's do it.
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah.
Why not? It's a thing that should happen, and I think we can do it. But no, that's exactly, you know, when I think about all the shill stuff and everything, it's so funny from the start. Like people don't realize like one thing that's, you know, people are saying like, you know, you're advocating that people should watch this show, and I'm like, well, like I can't talk about it if I don't watch it. You know, like we can't, like, and talking about it is what I do.
And I don't care if you watch it or not, but what I'm going to say won't make any sense.
Won't make any sense if you haven't watched it. So, like, yes, I'm planning to watch it. Yes. Do I think it's interesting? Of course I think it's interesting. I think lots of things are interesting. I think bad adaptations are interesting. Like, there's going to be interesting things to talk about. And that's why not being invested in it is so interested, is such a good place to be. Right? Mm-hmm. Because it's, I mean, like the Hobbit films are the classic example. And this is the thing that blows my mind about the lack of perspective that people were having with the Rings of Power thing. The thing that blows my mind is that the Hobbit films were not that long ago. I mean, it was 10 years, right? We're 10 years away from a disastrously bad set of adaptations, which, newsflash, didn't wreck the Hobbit. Like, I still love The Hobbit as much as I did before seeing the Hobbit films. And what's more, the Hobbit films were really interesting to talk about. Building up to them, watching them, as they, you know, analyzing them as they came out, talking about them afterwards. They're still really interesting to talk about. That doesn't mean I enjoy them. That doesn't mean I think that they're wonderful films. I don't. I think they're pretty bad films. But they're still interesting to talk about. There's still fascinating things that you can learn about Tolkien and come to appreciate better about The Hobbit and about The Lord of the Rings by watching and thinking through. Like, that's why analysis, it's this kind of thing is completely independent of whether, like, the value judgment of whether or not you think it's good. And this is the thing that I've been frustrated by for the last year and a half, is that everyone keeps assuming that there's only one conversation to be had. Like the only conversation to be had is it, do they suck or does it not suck? You know, and it's like that's in my mind, that's not even an interesting conversation.
That's so limited. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I literally don't care if I like them or not, if they're good or not. That's, I mean, I maybe I care a little in the sense that I would enjoy it even more if they're good. But but honestly, like, it's not going to have any impact in whether or not I watch, in whether or not I talk about it. Like, it's going to be, there will be really interesting things to be learned and lessons to be drawn from it and everything else, even if they turn out to be horrible, like the Hobbit films did, right? So, yeah.
I can't say I'm quite as diplomatic as Corey, but I feel like I'm aspiring to elements of that. I still find it hard to shelve all of my emotion for it. I don't think you're shelving it. You're just more interested in the analysis. That's the part that you latch onto.
Exactly. That's the thing.
And
I think
I'm emotion driven for all of this. So like, I'll be analytical, but I want to engage with the stuff that I care about. You know, so like, if I care about it, it's good. If it's good, I'll care about it more. There is that fine line. Like Phil said, it is easier to watch them when they're good. Yeah, it's easier to watch them when you're not cringing, and it's also easier to watch them when you're not cringing. And your friends came with you to see this movie because you love it, and it ends, and they're going, "That was terrible. This is your favorite book," and you're like, "Oh no!" Like, it's such a missed opportunity. So like, I get all of that. Yeah. But it's such a freedom to bring analysis like as what we do, you know, because I don't have to engage in that, you know. It just kind of shows when a movie ends and somebody next to me looks at me and goes, "What'd you think?" I hate that question because like, I'm not ready to answer that unless you have 4 hours to spare. Ready? Right. So I prefer to stick with the analysis and shelf the emotion for just my own. I think my theory, Maggie, about the difference between your reaction and mine is I think it's the difference between like an art historian and a painter going to an exhibit together, right? Ooh, okay. You're closer to the film side, so like what was done well or what was done, like the actual like the brush strokes and
exactly. Whereas like I mean, again, as a analyst, right? Like the art historian would look at a painting and be like, well, this is a really interesting example of this person's style. It's unsuccessful in certain ways, but it's interesting to compare those unsuccessful ways to the more successful work that they did during this other period, right? Whereas the artist would just look at it and be like, that's horrible, right? Like this person has no idea about brushstrokes. Oh my goodness! Like this could have been so much better if they do it.
Their lack of color understanding. Oh yeah,
exactly.
That's great. I like
so I remember like the very first. I'm remembering the bus ride back to the hotel from the New York premiere when we just watched episodes 1 and 2, and like the first thing you were thinking about several of the production things, right? Mm-hmm. And I was like thinking about red-haired Feanorian children, you know, in the opening sequence, right?
I'd forgotten that. Corey and I like holed away in the corner of the bus, and we're like, "Go." Yeah. And that didn't register with me because I didn't realize red hair was a problem. Then he explained it to me, and I was like,
"No, it was awesome. Yeah, I loved it. Yeah, okay, that was good." But anyway, so it's whenever I'm watching, especially an adaptation, especially a Tolkien adaptation, like for me personally, like did I like it, and do I because also increasingly, like again, I'm just a hardcore nerd. Like I do this. I don't put on an analysis hat because it's my job, right?
Right.
I do this job because that's what I love doing. Like I can't turn that off. I can't stop doing it. I'm doing this all the time. I mean, ask my family who will be annoyed by me when I'm, you know, like I'll be watching something, you know, while I'm doing dishes or something, and then I'll come in and rant and be like, "Oh my goodness, like did this thing that they were doing." Sometimes, usually I won't go in unless it's a cool thing that I am excited to talk about. Usually I won't make a complaint, but anyway, like I love this, like this kind of thing. And so increasingly, even to me, the question of did you like it is like, well, if it gives me really interesting stuff to talk about, then that's what I like, right? That's what I like. And you know, the you know, we all have the kind of like categories that matter to us, right? Some people are like, oh, like if the if the visuals are really stunning, I can forgive it. Like, but like the plot's not great, like whatever,
Right.
it's okay as long as the visuals are good. Or and people be the other way around, right? Like it was all empty and there was no
Performance
real
is
story.
great.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Acting, that's another thing. Like, oh, it was so beautifully acted. I don't care that it was poorly written and the story was ridiculous. Whatever. Different people have different priorities, right? For me, like, is it interesting to think and talk about is like number one in like almost everything else. Like I will not even notice. People will be like, oh, that was really well acted. I'm like, was it? Okay. Like
It didn't even register.
Didn't even register, right? Wasn't even
But that's
thinking
why
about
it's so
it.
interesting to have different people at the table. Like I was having this conversation about too many writers in the room, and I was like, well, yeah, sometimes that can be difficult because everyone wants to have their voice heard, but sometimes that's a total strength because they're going to see something like you see stuff I don't see, and vice versa. And that's what makes the conversation so much stronger and can make a script so much stronger if you bring those different skills to the table. So diversity in skills is a good thing too, even in watchers, even in viewers.
It is.
I'm going to call us because I hear dinner happening. So I'm
exactly. We are coming up to the end of our time here.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. I know summer has been a little bit weird. We've been traveling, and Maggie and I timed our family travel poorly. We lined things up poorly this summer.
And my husband's flight landed during Other Minds and Hands last week. So it's like, oh well. We'll be here next week, though, right?
We'll be here next
Normal.
week.
Okay.
We will. Yeah.
Yeah, and next week is episode 50, right, Higgy
It
Baby?
is.
We got to think of something to do.
Yeah.
Wear party hats?
Let's wear hats. Okay. Let's wear hats.
Recommendations welcome.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, if you guys have anything that you'd love to see us talk about in the 50th episode, be happy to do that. All right, very cool. So yeah, that'll be fun. So we'll be back next week. I think we'll be away. I'll be away the week after that. So it'll be another little hiatus, but we're coming down. So, all right, awesome. Thanks everybody,
Thanks,
and we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for joining us. Bye now.